I'm Rosie and welcome back to my channel. There are a lot of sourdough videos out there, but I'm going to show you the easiest, laziest way to make an amazing sourdough loaf. There's no stand mixer, no Dutch oven, no fancy banneton, no autolyse, no aliquot, no complicated dough folding at all. In fact, you don't even need to warm your water. Disclaimer, this is not your fancy Instagram loaf with all those designs and the quintessential ear, but this is your everyday, delicious sourdough for toast and sandwiches. When I was first learning how to make sourdough, I watched so many videos and read so many recipes. It was all confusing and overwhelming. Over time, I figured out how to cut out a ton of steps while still making delicious bread. This method is incredibly forgiving, and it's how I've been making homemade bread every week for the past year. Although it'll take about 24 hours from when you mix the dough till the time you bake the loaf, hands-on prep is super simple and only takes about 5 minutes. The long fermentation time basically does all the work for you. Instead of manually kneading or doing all those complex folds, time allows the yeast and the gas bubbles they create to develop the gluten structure, leading to a nice, chewy, airy crumb with wonderful flavor. I start the dough in the morning on the day before I bake the loaf. I use a total of 500 grams of flour, which is a mix of 350 grams of bread flour and 150 grams of sprouted whole wheat flour. You can use all bread flour if you like. To the flour, I add 2 teaspoons of Himalayan pink salt, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and 2 tablespoons of starter straight from the fridge. And then I gradually mix in 1½ cups of room temperature water. At this point, you can also add any extras you want, such as caraway seeds, sesame seeds, rosemary, black pepper, etc. Olive oil isn't a usual ingredient in sourdough because it softens the crust a bit, but I actually like the flavor and texture it creates. Unlike most recipes where the starter is carefully weighed, you'll notice that I'm kind of loosey-goosey about my starter measurement. And I know it sounds totally crazy to use it straight from the fridge. But again, the long fermentation time gives the starter plenty of time to activate right in the dough, so you don't have to do any prep work ahead of time. Once I don't see any dry flour anymore, I stop mixing and let the dough rest and hydrate. See how lumpy and bumpy it still is? Don't worry, this is ugly duckling dough. It'll smooth out with time. After about 1 to 2 hours, I fold the dough to gently smooth out any clumps of flour and create a dough ball. It's already starting to get more elastic at this stage. I'll come back to it after a few hours. In the meantime, let me show you how I maintain my starter. I feed my starter exclusively with dark rye flour, which I store in this Talenti jar. It's only about 2 tablespoons of starter here to begin with, and I add about 4 tablespoons of flour and enough water to create the consistency of thick pancake batter. I just go by feel, and honestly, if my starter has a bit more or less water, it doesn't make a noticeable difference in the final product with my method of baking bread. I let the starter ferment at room temperature for about 10 to 12 hours before putting it back in the fridge. Throughout the rest of the day, I fold the dough a few times every few hours. By the evening, the dough is well aerated and I'm ready to transfer it to a loaf pan. I first line a 9x5 pan with parchment paper and fold the dough into the shape of a loaf. There's nothing fancy here. I'm basically just tucking the sides of the dough under itself. Just make sure to pop any large surface bubbles. Yep, it's still ugly duckling dough. I'm going to cover it up with a second 9x5 loaf pan for its final proof overnight at room temperature, which ends up being around 68 degrees Fahrenheit for me. If you don't have a second pan, you can actually make a cap with aluminum foil. By the next morning, the dough has proofed really nicely and I'm ready to bake. For the first 20 minutes of baking, I keep the cover on, whether that's the second loaf pan or the foil cap. The cover traps in steam as the bread is baking, so the crust doesn't harden too early, and you can get a nice poofy loaf, also known as oven spring. This is why people like to bake bread in a Dutch oven, because the lid traps in the steam. But the issues that I have with the Dutch oven are: 1, you have to preheat it for an hour at a very high temperature, and I don't have time for that. And 2, it's very heavy and unwieldy, and I always feel like I'm going to burn myself on it. So basically, I'm doing the same thing with a loaf pan or foil cover, and I don't need to preheat anything except my oven. I hope you can see from this video how easy homemade sourdough can be. Give it a try and let me know how it goes in the comments. Please subscribe for easy cooking and baking videos, and I will see you next time. Bye!